In many cities and forests, there are color markings on trees that look weird to an unknowing spectator. In fact, most such markings are used for two reasons: to make the trees to be cut or left alone stand out from the rest, and to make an owned forest boundary line visible. There are no specific rules for the color or shape of markings, but the most universal ones for cutting are blue lines, and the markings for preserving trees are usually orange or yellow. Trees within city limits are usually marked for cutting with red, orange, or yellow lines or dots. If you see such a marking on a tree and you have a car parked nearby, best move it somewhere farther away so that the tree doesn't fall on it when it's cut down. Trees in a forest can be marked for preserving because they have good cavities for wildlife to make homes in, or there are nests on their branches. It's a frequent practice to leave the surrounding trees intact too, so that the birds and animals in that particular tree are not disturbed. Large and healthy seed and nut-bearing trees are also marked for preserving because many animals and birds feed on their seeds and nuts. Unhealthy trees can be preserved too, surprisingly, if woodpeckers seem to like them. It means there are many bugs inside those trees that the birds use as food. Color markings on trees in a forest might also mean someone owns the forest up to a certain boundary and decided to show it. These markings can be made in any color and shape, but they always have two specific features you can't miss. One is that the markings go in a more or less straight line, which is logical because it's a boundary of a territory. And the second feature is that, according to the marking rules, the markings always have to be close to each other, so that the next one is clearly visible from the one you're looking at in both directions. Some believe that yellow markings are left on female ginkgo trees growing around cities of the US, but there's no hard evidence of that. Still, you can find a detailed map of such trees in New York or Washington, D.C., for example. Female ginkgos do deserve a map of their own, since they bear fruit that smell really, really awful. If you ever had a piece of butter gone rancid in your kitchen, you probably know that odor. The trees were brought to the U.S. in the 18th through 19th centuries, when a drive for experimentation and all things exotic was going strong. And since ginkgos are very sturdy trees and can withstand harsh conditions, they grew popular in the country. Many cities planted them for green decoration purposes, but unfortunately, lots of them turned out to be females. To avoid the trees bringing their unpleasant smell into the cities, they've been sprayed with a special solution that prevents them from fruiting. The solution is safe for both people and animals, so there's no need to worry about being in the vicinity while maintenance workers spray the trees. Color markings can be seen in the streets too, not only on trees. If you walk around the town and see a red line on the pavement, for example, it means there's a power line or cable beneath you. These lines are marked red to stand out the most, because if they're damaged while digging, it can lead to a lot of trouble, maybe even more than with gas pipes. Orange lines mean essentially the same, only those signify there's a telecommunication or signal line or cable. These things don't carry power, so disrupting them is not as bad as damaging power cables, but it would still cause a lot of inconvenience to people around the block. For example, breaking a fiber optic cable might shut down the internet in a large area until the damage is repaired. A yellow line means there's natural gas, oil, steam, petroleum, or some other conduit of flammable material underneath. Lines are usually drawn in such a way as to show the direction the pipe is laid down below, and the line itself is in its center. Yellow is as much a color of warning as red, which makes perfect sense. A broken gas pipe and a spark are a recipe for a huge disaster. Green lines signify there's a sewer or storm drain underground. Breaking a sewer facility can cost an excavation worker their entire career, and for a good reason. Imagine what kind of a mess it would result in. And apart from the sewer contents breaking free and creating chaos on the surface, damaging the pipeworks will almost certainly result in huge costs of repairs and lots of inconvenience for hundreds of people living close by. Since water is blue, it makes sense for city markings signifying a source of drinking water to be blue too. Damaging such a source is not as bad as breaking a petroleum pipe or a power cable, but it still is a cause of trouble for people around. In big cities, though, It's more of a nuisance than something serious, because potable water is normally easily accessible. Breaking a water pipe or main brings more problems to the excavating or construction project itself. The water will flood the surroundings, making it a mess to deal with as quickly as possible. Purple markings also mean water, but not of a drinking kind. Lines of this color signify there's a source of irrigation or reclaimed water down below. Such water is taken from sandblasting or power washing and is normally used for industrial or gardening purposes afterwards. It's not meant for drinking, but the results of breaking through a pipe carrying this water are pretty much the same as with potable water. The mess will be more than real. Pink markings on the ground are left by land surveyors. When there's a legal argument for property limits, for example, an independent surveyor will leave pink lines on the ground to mark the boundaries. These can also be left at proposed construction sites for the same reason. White lines, dots, and crosses mark out the territory for proposed excavation routes or limits. It means there will soon be digging done within those premises. White markings usually indicate the exact place the excavation should be done at. They're the first step before any actual work can be performed. Later, city maintenance workers will find out if there are any facilities beneath that spot that should be avoided. If there are none, or if there's no conflict between the digging and the underground facilities, more about that later, the excavation can begin. City markings can also be drawn not as lines, but as other shapes. For instance, you might see an H shape on the ground. The two parallel lines signify the edges of the pipe or cable below, while the center line connecting them is there to make it easier to measure the width. There might also be the name of the company that laid down the pipe or cable next to the H shape. A diamond shape is another frequent marking on the ground. It might or might not have two parallel lines marking the edges of the conduit below, while the diamond shape itself means the approximate size of the thing beneath your feet. Some markings look more like graffiti, with lots of cryptic symbols and letters, but these are usually abbreviations and signs for the city maintenance or construction workers. For example, you might see a white cross or square drawn on the ground to mark a proposed excavation site. The workers will often write a "No" followed by an abbreviated name of the facility below. You might think it means no excavation should be done here, but it's the exact opposite. No means no conflict between the power lines, pipes, or whatever other facility is buried underneath and the proposed excavation plan. The abbreviations are also written in the color of the facility they designate. For instance, if there's no G written in yellow paint in a white square, it means the site can be excavated without fearing that a gas pipe below, hence the G, will be disturbed. And if there's a telecommunications cable underneath, the city services will often draw an orange "No" and then an abbreviated name of the company that laid down the cable. Another way to say the same thing is to draw an abbreviated facility type and cross it out. A yellow G, sometimes in a circle, means a gas pipe below, and if it's crossed out, there should be no worries about excavating in this area. No gas pipes will be damaged.
Have you ever sat in the bathroom wondering why toilet paper has fancy patterns on them? Well, if you're in there long enough, I guess you would finally get around to that. Turns out those prints actually serve a purpose. They use the prints to fluff up the paper a bit and make it more absorbent. The unique patterns help differentiate different companies' products on the market. Also, recycled toilet paper is a thing, but it's not as popular or well sold in the US as it is in Europe and Latin America. And that's all I have to say about that. Ah, yes, one of the greatest mysteries of the snack world. Why do crackers have holes in them? Crackers start out as hydrated dough, which means that they have a lot of wet ingredients in them compared to dry ones like flour and salt. So, when hydrated dough bakes, it releases steam as they get heated through. It results in something called an open crumb. It's a texture that is full of small air pockets. If we need a perfectly crispy cracker, the dough needs to release the steam that's accumulated in there. And that's where the holes come in handy, and all that crisp is thanks to them. Now, this star some old houses and barns have isn't something we pay attention to, but it's very familiar. It's known as a barn star, regardless of where it's located. put it on a castle, it's still a barn star. No one is sure where exactly it takes its roots and what it originally meant, but they became particularly common for people to use at the end of the 19th century. Apparently, people used to paint geometric figures on their barns, and each one would mean something. The star was believed to bring good luck. Some people also interpret it as signifying welcome, and they started to put it on houses. Other people just say that they look cool and only serve a decorative purpose. Now, I'm pretty sure you've noticed that electrical plugs have holes in their prongs. But what are they used for? Well, a century ago, when the first plugs were designed, they had prongs with indents. Those indents would align with bumps inside the sockets to secure them there, so that it won't fall out. Later, the indents were replaced with holes, and it was for the same purpose. Modern-day plugs don't need holes to be secured inside. They're secured with friction and pressure. Holes are still useful though, but only during manufacturing. Some insert a rod through the holes to keep them steady while they wrap them in plastic. Other than that, holes have no use, and they are optional, so the manufacturers can decide if they have them or not. I was driving a couple of days ago and noticed those trees that you paint white at the bottom. Turns out it's a common thing to do. You see, the lower trunks of trees are painted white to help the process called sun scald. Sun scalding happens in the winter, and it's the process where extreme fluctuations in temperatures causes the bark of the tree to split. The layer of white paint serves as a long-lasting tree sunscreen. They also use this method of painting the tree trunks in orchards and tree farms. It's done to protect the young trees and give them the best possibility of surviving their first years. I've noticed that in older cartoons, quite a bunch of characters wear white gloves. I did some research and found out that back when animated movies were black and white, putting white gloves on characters was a way to make the hands stand out from the black bodies. Then animation evolved, but the gloves stayed as a Disney tradition. But there are other reasons too. Human hands make animal characters more humanized and relatable. Also, those gloves are way easier to animate, which speeds up the process. Also, many cartoon characters have 4 fingers, and there are reasons for that as well. First, only drawing 4 fingers makes the work of animators easier. While human figures were portrayed more realistically, animals and other characters could be fine with 4 fingers, and the creators were taking advantage of that. Also, there's a visual reason. Walt Disney himself told once that if this famous mouse had 5 fingers, his hands would look like a bunch of bananas. Growing up and watching morning cartoons before school, I never really understood why some of the adult characters didn't show their faces. Turns out, I was halfway to knowing the reason. The adults weren't the main focus of the shows. They were just there doing their adult stuff, while the main characters, often young-age characters or animals, were doing all the fun stuff. But the adult characters were always there to keep an eye on the main characters and help them if they asked. From an animation standpoint, it was also cheaper, easier, and way less time-consuming for the animators back then not to do the faces. This way, they wouldn't have had to do the faces or synchronize the lips for every speaking segment the character might have had. They could also just reuse old animations or change as little as possible if the writers changed the script at the last minute. It was saving companies lots of time and money. Now, we've all seen a house with 2 chimneys, but do they have an actual purpose, or is it purely for the aesthetic? Turns out they actually did have a purpose back in the day. In the older houses that are located in colder climates, it was fairly common to have one chimney with 2 or more separate flues, passages for conveying gases to the outdoors. Back in the day, houses weren't as airtight as these days, so they needed more heating sources to stay warm. People had fireplaces and several wood-burning stoves. Having several flues allowed residents to vent all those gases at once. Modern houses are built way more airtight and isolated, so they don't really need more than one heating source to stay warm and cozy, even in colder climates. So, the 2 chimneys serve more of an aesthetic purpose. Also, they're costly to remove, even if someone lives in an older house. Sometimes car steering wheels are grossly sticky, and here's why. Steering wheels are often covered with materials like vinyl or leather, and both of them are prone to collect surface residues like dust, food grease, oil, and sweat from your palms. Even if you don't feel like your hands are dirty when you touch the wheel, there's always something on them, and that material is happy to keep it. At some point, surface residue accumulates enough to give you that sticky feeling. You have two solutions. Either wear driving gloves or just wipe the steering wheel once in a while, and you're golden. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but some school buses have white roofs. Apparently, roofs are painted white to ensure that the inside is cool on hot days. The thing is that dark colors, especially black, absorb light and heat. That's why asphalt is especially hot on hot days, and that's why you feel hot in dark clothes in summer. A white color, on the other hand, reflects the light and the heat, and everything gets heated less fast. If you've traveled, you could have noticed that the same temperature feels different in different places. 80 degrees Fahrenheit in Nevada is much more tolerable, but the same 80 degrees Fahrenheit is a whole different story in Alaska or Florida. And the key here is humidity. It's the amount of water that's contained in the air. Nevada is the state with the lowest humidity, 38%, and Alaska has a humidity of 77%. Here's how it works. One of the ways your body tries to cool down during hot weather is by sweating. As the sweat evaporates, it takes away the heat as well, and it leaves. In humid settings, the sweat evaporates less, staying on your body and just dripping down. So not only do you stay all wet, but the heat also stays, so you feel hotter. But hey, don't sweat it. Just stay inside near the air conditioning all summer. Don't go out at all. Well, that's not going to work.
The 28-year-old patient shows up at the hospital with distressing symptoms. He explained to the doctors that he felt really bad chest discomfort and had been coughing badly for quite some time. The medical staff knew right away there was no time to waste, so he was scheduled for an X-ray. Weirdly, there was nothing unusual about the X-ray results. The patient just had a mass in his lungs that they needed to remove as soon as possible. Sure, it wasn't the best news for the man, but it was certainly nothing the doctors hadn't seen before. But that first opinion changed on the day of the surgery. Not only was the whole operation more difficult than they had initially expected, but the mass they removed from the patient had an unusual shape. When the probe was sent for further investigation, the doctors were puzzled. It was a small fir tree. The doctors that had participated in the operation thought that the man must have inhaled a seed which settled inside the man's lungs. After the seed grew into a sapling, its little needles started to damage the tissue surrounding it, which resulted in chest discomfort and coughing. As the story gained more popularity, scientists weighed in on the mysterious story, and they weren't so quick to accept it, saying it was most likely made up. On one hand, most plants need a lot of sunlight to grow, which isn't available in a human lung. More so, if it were that simple, we'd all have things growing in our bodies. Small seeds aren't that hard to swallow or inhale, right? This wasn't the only story about plants growing in a human lung that baffled scientists. In 2010, a man from Massachusetts was hospitalized after his lung collapsed. Again, this didn't seem to take doctors by surprise, as unfortunate as it was, because the patient already had a history of respiratory issues. Nevertheless, they discovered a mass inside the man's lung and removed it immediately. What they found was equally as surprising as the fir tree, a small pea plant. Only this time, doctors suggested that the man probably had peas for dinner. But that one simply went the wrong way and didn't end up in his stomach as it should have. Once it reached his lungs, the small pea got comfortable and began sprouting leaves. The truth is a bit more complex in this case, but it does make it more plausible. Turns out that the piece that was removed from the man's lung was only about half an inch long. Something that small doesn't qualify as a full-grown plant. But the seed was able to grow though. That's because a pea seed can sprout even without light. It naturally does that underground. The seed doesn't need to have any light at this point because the tiny seed has enough energy stored inside to help it grow to the level of the soil, where it gets the sunlight it needs to continue. Because of their relationship with the sun, plants are called autotrophs. or organisms that use exposure to light to feed themselves. A lot of us think that plants get their daily menu from the soil we place them in, but that's not feeding them. Plants need sunlight, water, and the gases in the air to produce glucose, the substance they use for food. This whole process is called photosynthesis and is performed by all plants, algae, and even a bunch of microorganisms, like the purple sulfur bacteria. Now back to our unfortunate human patient. While it's true that the pea seed might have germinated since it had sufficient moisture in there to survive, it didn't grow into a full-sized plant. It would have needed sunlight for that so that photosynthesis could begin. That's not to say it wasn't damaging or dangerous. A lot of other emergency room doctors have similar stories too, like this one coming from some doctors in Essex, whose patient initially seemed to have lost her dentures. The woman was elderly and already had memory problems, and they initially didn't give this mistake much thought. That wasn't until the woman was later discovered to have some other problems with her lungs too. It didn't take them long to connect the dots and figure out that the woman's upper dentures weren't all lost. They were just inside her body. The woman had swallowed them but didn't realize, and they got stuck at the bottom of her throat, also causing her respiratory problems. Not all such mishaps happened by accident. Another man in the UK wanted to offer his fiancée the engagement ring of her dreams, but it didn't fit his budget, so he came up with what he believed to be a clever plan. He went to the jewelry parlor and patiently waited for the jeweler to shift his focus from the ring for a split second. As soon as that happened, he swallowed the ring. The jeweler wasn't easily tricked and called the police. Once under the metal detectors, the man could only confess. The crafty romantic was escorted to a cell where he was expected to, pass the ring back to its rightful owner. It's not the only reason people were caught swallowing jewelry. A woman once came up to the emergency doctor complaining about stomach pains. There was nothing bizarre about her. On the contrary, she was a middle-aged woman, both fashionable and tidy. Her physical exam didn't reveal anything suspicious about her. But the x-ray they had to make sure did. As they were looking at the images, the doctors were perplexed. A whole lot of jewelry was stuck inside the woman's stomach and intestines. The medical staff obviously questioned her about how the objects got there, and her response was even more outrageous. She said she wanted to keep her jewelry safe from her husband, which she claimed had a bit of a habit of gifting her jewelry to other women. Nice guy. One other doctor remembered having a patient with a bottle cap stuck in his throat. The problem is, he didn't even notice he had a strange object stuck inside of him. It was simply discovered at a routine checkup. Fortunately, no surgery was needed to fish this one out. Doctors managed to get it out using a small medical net. They were curious how this man managed to get a bottle cap stuck in his throat and not even know it. His response was simple. He did remember drinking water some days prior, but he couldn't find the cap. He brushed the whole thing off and went on with his day. Other times, naughty things we do when we were young can come back to haunt us years later. A 30-year-old woman surely learned this lesson the hard way when she ended up in the emergency room with a stuffy nose. No medicine seemed to help, so she knew she had to get it examined by a professional. Once the doctors had a look, they realized she had some inflamed tissue up her nose and something that resembled a foreign object. It also looked like that object had been there for quite some time. They couldn't figure out what it was, so she was immediately taken to the operating room. What the surgeons removed was then taken to be further investigated, and it turned out to be some sort of material resembling paper. After they questioned her, the woman did remember having stuffed some paper in her nose when she was little, but was just as surprised as the doctors that the small piece had stayed there up her nose for over 20 years. Some extractions of foreign objects are more complicated than others. A kid ended up at the emergency room after he stuffed his brother's plastic construction toy up his nose. As the doctors were trying to carefully remove it, the kid coughed, and the toy went down his throat and into his stomach. Both the doctors and the kid's family patiently waited for the boy to pass the toy out to the final destination. That's probably because the kid wanted to give it back to his brother. But it's probably okay for the kid to keep it.